Hello, and welcome to Walking with the Tengu, a podcast exploring classic texts for the modern martial artist. I really appreciate that each and every one of you has chosen to join me on this walk. We're trying out a new setup today. My podcast stuff changed, and it's made it challenging to get episodes recorded, but we'll see if this works. So if you have any feedback, let me know. Alright, so today's topic is about regulating tension. I was listening to the BJJ Mental Models podcast a while back about common jiu-jitsu mistakes, and Matt Kwan started off with an idea that really resonated with me. He said one of the most common mistakes and easiest ways to differentiate between a new and experienced person in jiu-jitsu is whether they can regulate their tension. New people have a tendency to be far too tense, going as hard as they can, gripping as hard as they are capable, trying to muscle their way through a match as if their life depended on it. A common response, and one I've been guilty of, is to tell them to not use as much strength. However, that hasn't always sat quite right with me. I'd say something like, don't use strength, focus on your technique. And I just didn't realize until now, because while it is true, it's also not entirely accurate, which is kind of a funny thing to say, but is a topic to delve into on another episode. But there's this balance between when and why we should use tension in our contending with another person. If we use all of our strength at a constant rate throughout a match, we will inevitably tire ourselves out very quickly. Knowing this, I would advise new people that they need to slow down and focus more on their technique than just the raw application of their strength. And of course, this brings the natural criticism that strength is an important variable in any match and should be used, which is true. So when Matt Kwan started talking about regulating tension, I realized this was the key point with which to make a differentiation. It's not about whether we use strength or not. It's that we need to be more intelligent and strategic about why we are using our strength. An advanced martial artist will use their strength in a way that maximizes their efficiency and is based on timing so as to preserve their stamina to last longer in a match. This is true in self-defense too. The person who exhausts first will usually lose. Once you're exhausted, you are generally at the mercy of your enemy. There is a time and a place to go all out, but to do it without intent and purpose leads to defeat. So with that in mind, let's look at what some of the classics have to say about tension in the martial arts. So not too long ago, this idea also came up in my Iaido class. My teacher was giving me some pointers on timing and mentioned that I needed to release my tension after cuts rather than maintaining the same tension throughout the entirety of each kata. One of the reasons for this was because if I remained tense throughout an entire engagement, it would tire me out faster and make it more challenging to move. Mind you, my teacher is also a high-ranked kendoka, so he doesn't say these things from purely theory, but regularly tests his skill and technique in a competitive arena against opponents who want him to lose. So when he tells me I need to release my tension after a cut so I can be quicker with my opponent, yeah, I listen. And it's funny because this was something that, as I mentioned earlier, had come up in my jiu-jitsu training too, which makes me suspect this is one of those universal concepts across all martial arts. If we are hard, tense, and exerting all our strength, not only do we tire faster, but we lose the ability to adapt and react to our opponent. To help me with this, he referenced two Japanese concepts relating to timing. One I've heard many times, Jo-Ha-Kyu. And despite him demonstrating it to me in many different ways, I still struggle to replicate it in my own training. And the other was a new term to me, Merihari. So long story short, I've been drawing a connection between tension and timing. The key to the proper regulation of strength and tension in a martial arts context can only be properly utilized when placed within a framework of proper timing. If we are tense at the wrong time, we limit what we can do. Thus, throughout this process of considering tension, I eventually came to I eventually came to the conclusion that understanding timing was necessary to regulate tension in the right way. So let's start with Jo-Ha-Kyu. This is a concept that first came from court music, of all places, and eventually was built into a variety of different classical arts, from things like the martial arts to tea ceremony, poetry, and traditional theater like No and Kabuki. Roughly translated, it can mean something like beginning, break, rapid, and basically means that everything we do should begin slowly, speed up, and then end swiftly. And it was at the end, with the swift ending, that my teacher was saying was the time to release tension. In a grappling context, I might consider an example to be where I've executed a sudden sweep or reversal on someone and then need to solidify the position in my new, more dominant place. If I retained a death grip on what I had been doing, the sweep, this would provide a level of rigidity that my opponent might exploit and doesn't accomplish anything since the sweep is over. Never mind the massive waste of energy and stamina it would cost me to keep it. If I rather release my tension and prepare to adapt to my opponent's likely defensive actions, I can I can react more quickly and efficiently and preserve my stamina. If you're really good, you might even be able to anticipate their defensive response and set up a submission that exploits their expected movement. We might think of this like a feint in boxing that generates a predictable movement from our opponent that then allows us to sneak in a strong hit when their defense is lower, or when we can interrupt their timing. All right. So, continuing onward here. What was interesting about this was that there was another aspect to it that my EIDU teacher went on to emphasize. And so it wasn't just physically releasing tension, but mentally as well. And as you'll see later, this combination of both the mental and the physical, of releasing the tension both in the body and in the mind, promotes a relaxed awareness that is characteristic of the more experienced martial artist, and is one of those areas that in the past centuries have come up in the classics. Okay, so the next term. I hate to say it, but Medihali is a concept I wasn't able to dig up much on in time for this episode, so I'll give the dictionary definition. First, modulation of voice. Second, variation, variety, balance, pace. Or third, liveliness. The example given is of a writing style. And that's all I've got at the moment. So I'll shelf the word for now and look for it in classical works as I study them. However, I'm not certain this is a classical word. It could be a modern word. I don't know if there's a classical analog or if it is used in classical works. I have the kanji for it, but it is apparently usually written in katakana these days, which, if you're not familiar, is a phonetic alphabet usually used for foreign words. So I'm not sure what's going on there. I'll have to dig into it more. So, all right, so what Japanese classical works talk about these concepts? There is a section in the Book of Five Rings about rhythm, and you can find a free copy of this work on archive.org. And I've included a link in the episode description to that, because, like always, I recommend you read these works for yourself. So, one translation of Musashi's words might be, there is timing in everything. Timing in strategy cannot be mastered without a great deal of practice. Timing is important in dancing and pipe or string music, for they are in rhythm only if timing is good. Timing and rhythm are also involved in the military arts, shooting bows and guns and riding horses. In all skills and abilities, there is timing. There is timing in the whole life of the warrior, in his thriving and declining, in his harmony and discord. Similarly, there is timing in the way of the merchant, in the rise and fall of capital. All things entail rising and falling timing. You must be able to discern this. In strategy, there are various timing considerations. From the outset, you must know the applicable timing and the inapplicable timing. And from among the large and small things and the fast and slow timings, find the relevant timing. First, seeing the distance timing and the background timing. This is the main thing in strategy. It is especially important to know the background timing, otherwise your strategy will become uncertain. You win in battles with the timing in the void, born of the timing of cunning, by knowing the enemy's timing, and this using a timing which the enemy does not expect. all the 5 books are chiefly concerned with timing. You must train sufficiently to appreciate all this. End quote. So it seems like to Musashi, timing's pretty important. And it might suggest that the entirety of the book is, at least according to him, chiefly concerned with timing. So timing seems to me to be key to deciding when and when not to use tension. The fundamental problem I found in both Iaido and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was the misuse of tension based on the timing of what was happening, what we were doing with our bodies. So by extension, then I'd say it's safe to consider the understanding of timing to be crucial to the proper use of tension. Moving on to another classical work, you may recall the Tengu Geijutsuron, the book that gave this podcast its name. Now, before we go any further, let me just insert a quick contextual note on the upcoming use of the word qi. Throw away any preconceived notions on what this word means in English. Think of it instead as a specific word for a energy concept, or not as a specific energy concept, and instead think of it as the word just plain energy. This is a combination of any kind of thermal, kinetic, chemical, mechanical, and gravitational energy. Words like weather in Chinese are directly translated as sky qi, sky energy. Magnetism in rocks, in iron, is described as stone qi, stone energy. And they use that word qi for everything that we call energy. So when you hear qi referred to in the use of our bodies, don't think of some kind of Star Wars Jedi energy like the Force, but instead think of all the things that go into the use of your body. Your nutrition, muscular strength, breathing, and the intent and will of your mind, just to name a few. The word qi is just a short, useful way to refer to the combination of all these anatomical and biological systems working together when we do the martial arts. So, from chapter 3 of the Tengu sermon on the martial arts, we find, now the weak and the soft are different altogether. The soft contains living qi and performs function. The weak is simply not strong and is unable to perform function. Being at rest and being inert are also completely different. Being at rest does not distance itself from living qi, but being inert is slightly removed from it. What's being described here, that's the end of the quote, by the way. So, what's being described here is just the difference between the lack of skill and dependence on raw strength of the beginner, which has no purpose, and the relaxed lack of tension in the experienced practitioner. One Shozanshi calls weakness, but highlights that we shouldn't mistake this with the calm relaxation of the professional. This he simply describes as being soft, and hence has living qi, and can perform function. He highlights this by contrasting being at rest and being inert. If you are sitting at rest, it can be a state of relaxed awareness, where you aren't tense, but can move freely should you need to. Being inert, on the other hand, perhaps from exhaustion, is a state of so-called rest, where you don't have living qi, but are instead overcome with weakness. These are two very different states of rest. So continuing in the same chapter, we find more. A person who is tense relies on qi, but has difficulty in loosening it. Relying on thoughts or concepts, you will become taut. The qi of yin becomes taut on its own, and the person who relies altogether on qi will not be swift in responding to some action. Thus, a tense or taut qi will be slow in its function of technique. But the person whose qi goes first will dry up his technique's practical application. This is yang and lacks foundation. It will be light and parched, and will be like withered leaves scattered by the wind. This is probably something most martial artists have observed in classes. A new student comes in with all their clumsy fear and self-doubt. When trying to follow along with what's going on in class, they have a tendency to do things way too hard, strong, and fast, with a tension that ultimately hinders their ability to practice. One of the things that I found in jiu-jitsu is that For newcomers, I almost always have to repeatedly say, relax and slow down. Sometimes I'll joke with them in an attempt to break the tension by suggesting that they relax harder. Jazanshi is describing this state as one's chi being too young, too strong, too hard, too tense. He's correct when he says that this will dry up a technique's practical application. And I suspect this is what my Iaido teacher was talking about when he corrected me from being too tense continuously. Instead, Shozanshi says that yin chi will be taught on its own. It doesn't have to be forced, and then if you do this, the technical function of your skill will be fast. Now, you've probably heard of yin and yang at some point, and have an idea that one is light and the other dark, one is strength and the other is weakness. This is where our minds, constrained by English linguistics, inhibit our understanding. If we only hear weakness and think of it in a negative light. Jazanshi already tried to highlight to us the difference between the weakness of a beginner and the softness of an expert. It is this relaxed, soft yin chi of the expert he's talking about here. That yin chi is tense on its own at the right time. It doesn't have to be forced like the clumsy beginner yang chi, which is Hulk smashing their way through techniques. Alright, so continuing in the text here. The person who is too damp and stagnant will be dragged down by a muddy chi that is heavy itself and will be slow in practical application. The person who is too concentrated will focus on chi with partiality and will render his form shackled and rigid. He will come to a standstill and will be unable to move. Thus his action and response will be all the slower, like a stream that has frozen and is unable to melt. This again is the congealing of thought and the congealing of chi. What we call thought is also chi. The known is called thought. The unknown is called chi. You should test this out and know it on your own. End quote. So this damp, stagnant, in other words, muddy chi is where we can get too concentrated on looking at what our opponent is doing, such that we forget to think about what we are doing ourselves. Or we are thinking so hard about what we are doing that we forget to think about what our opponent is doing. If we overanalyze and try to anticipate far too much, we focus too much on the horizon, and in doing so lose sight of what is directly in front of us. Jozanshi's description here of congealed thought and congealed chi being expressed as a form that is shackled and rigid, of coming to a standstill and being unable to move, thus all action response being slower, is exactly what we are talking about today. Tension without purpose. Thus, the tension with purpose, at the right time, that is then released and relaxed in preparation for whatever comes next, is the balance we ought to seek in our training. It is interesting that this guy who was writing about 3 centuries ago could describe, in the words of his own time, the very thing that many of us still experience today in our own training. Though we are separated by language, culture, and the vastness of time, the nature of human experience is probably not all that different when one considers that we struggle with a lot of the same challenges. I find it interesting that Shozanshi says that what is known is called thought, and that what is unknown is called chi. It almost is as if he's describing what he knows, but acknowledges there's more going on here than he truly understands. And so in absence of the proper terms and description, he just calls it chi. In the same way that I'm not going to describe all the psychological and physiological functions that go into why a person's hyperfocus and overanalyzation inhibits their ability to act and respond in a complete competent fashion. That would be inefficient and ineffective. Maybe instead it would be more efficient to simply say that their chi is muddy. To be fair, I don't think that will help the person who's constantly tense and wearing themselves out with overexertion during training. However, I do like what Shozanshi says at the end of this section, in the spirit of the scientific method. You should test this out and know it on your own. The first practical concept for regulating tension I would suggest is to learn to regulate your breath. With your breath, you can positively impact your stress response and your heart rate, which will allow for clearer thinking while under stress. In a sense, you have to recognize first that you are not regulating your tension to be able to start controlling it. The most common form of breath control I've come across was called tactical breathing in my law enforcement training, prenatal breathing while my wife and I were prepping for the birth of our first child, and yogic breathing in yoga. It consists of 4 parts. Step 1, inhale. A good place to start is the count of 4. Step 2, hold that breath for a count of 4. Step 3, exhale for a count of 4. And lastly, step 4, hold that exhale for a count of 4. And then repeat. I remember early on in my training, particularly after we were made to simulate some kind of high-stress combative scenario, I would have a really hard time doing any of that for a count of 4. It was usually more 1 or 2 breaths, or a count of 1 to 2, sometimes 3, but that was the best. Well, what I realized was as I continued the practice in the moment, my heart rate would slow, and eventually after a few moments, I'd be able to do it for a count of 4 and think more clearly. If you find yourself under stress during a match or some other kind of high-stress scenario, try this breathing. I suspect you'll find yourself better equipped to handle whatever you're facing. There is, however, one caveat. You have to practice it beforehand, even if it's just once a day for a single cycle. Practice this breathing when you are not under stress, so your body already knows it when you are under stress. This is like adding the tool to your tool belt so that it's ready the moment you need it. When you're at the top of the ladder, balancing precariously, that is when you need the tool already on your belt. The tool, in this case breathing, should not be at the base of the ladder outside of reach. Practice this breathing now, in the spare moments throughout your day, so that when it comes time to face something stressful, it is there at the ready to help you regulate your tension, whether it be mental or physical. There is a time to use strength, and a time to relax, a time to go all out, and a time to pull back. Knowing when the right time is to use your strength is the key to regulating your tension, and thus dominating the rhythm and flow of a high-stress combative engagement. As always, remember to not just talk about philosophy, but like your martial art, live it.